So now I'm going to introduce to you Reverend Dr. Dave Gregory and Lizzie Henderson, who are going to present to us about reaching children and young people. Dave is trained as a Baptist minister, but has a background in physics and astronomy. He worked at the Met Office and the European Weather Centre for 15 years before he moved into parish ministry, and has done a lot of work with schools and churches and community groups, and has become known as, is it Dr. Dave, the scientist, as he does messy church with his church. So you're going to hear from him. You're also going to hear from Lizzie Henderson, who is the Youth and Schools Outreach Officer at the Faraday Institute, and she's also the coordinator for the Children's Media Project, which is just starting in a couple of months. You'll no doubt hear about that in what she has to say. So she is involved in going into schools, giving talks, leading workshops, and so on. And hopefully some of you have seen the hands-on science table. Don't be shy. We all like to muck about with experiments every now and then, no matter how old we are. And so I will leave them to you, and looking forward to your presentation.
Okay, so I'm kicking off this little tag team double act. As Ruth said, we really just want to explore a little bit of how we might think about these interactions between science and religion with children and with young people. And some of you may already be asking the question, well, why? I'm sure you're all far more well informed than that, but it's a question I quite often get when I tell people what I do, and they get some idea of, well, these are deep and profound and complicated questions that you're discussing, and surely it's too early to think about talking about these with young people. I tell them I go into schools and talk to children as young as 3 about these things, and this look comes across their face like, how can you possibly discuss the interactions of quantum physics and theology with a 3-year-old? But you'd be surprised. And that's the kind of thing we're going to talk a little bit about today. We're going to look a little bit at how we do this in schools and how we might do it in churches as well. All of this is very applicable to really any situation or environment where there are any young people. And I'm sure you're all in contact with a few of those. So to start off, I want you to play along with me a little bit. I'm going to run through a bit of an activity I often use to begin sessions in schools or churches or anywhere, really. And this is really to try and help the people that I'm talking to engage with the topic a little bit. I was just chatting to somebody and saying the difference between talking to this kind of audience compared to talking to an audience in a school is that usually in a school you're dealing with a bunch of people who don't really want to be there, haven't necessarily decided they want to come and think about this topic right now. So this is quite a useful activity to start thinking about that. But I'd like you to role play it a little bit with me. So I'm going to put some statements up here. And usually what I would do is I would get the young people I'm talking to tell me how much they agree or disagree with these statements. And I would often do that by getting them all standing up and running around the room to different parts of it to show me I'm not going to get you to do that now. You'll be pleased to know we're a little bit packed in. But I am going to ask for some hands up. And in order to do this, I'd like you to imagine, take yourself back in your mind, imagine you are somewhere between the ages of about 5 and 15. You can pick your favourite age in that range, and try and respond to these statements as you think somebody of that age might do. So the first statement, science can or will be able to explain everything. Science can or will be able to explain everything. Now, which of you mostly agrees with that statement? And which of you would mostly disagree? Interesting, okay. How about this? Now that we have science, we don't need religion anymore. Now that we have science, we don't need religion anymore. Who mostly agrees with that? And who's disagreeing? Overwhelming, astounding, okay. Now what about this? Science and religion give different answers to the same questions. Science and religion give different answers to the same questions. Who mostly agrees with that? Yeah, quite a few of you. And who's going to disagree? So you can imagine at this point, as you're all running around the classroom and you're suddenly having wildly different opinions to your best friend, and all the discussion starts about this. How about this? Science can prove that God does or does not exist. Science can prove that God does or does not exist. Who agrees with that? Some of you? Ruth's 9-year-old self is agreeing with this. And who disagrees? Okay. And what about this last one? Most scientists are atheists. Most scientists are atheists. Who mostly agrees with that?
Can we say don't know, miss?
You can say don't know. Who mostly disagrees? Excellent, thank you. There's always a lot of don't know in this, and actually just on a practical level, the advantage of having the kind of moving around the room thing is that they get to show you quite how much they agree or disagree, and you get some really fun situations where some of them will immediately run to disagree before you've even said anything because they're convinced they're going to completely disagree with you on everything you say. And then they suddenly find themselves moving around the room quite a lot. But hopefully that's given you a little bit of a sense, not only to think about these kind of topics for yourself a bit more, but to think about, well, what might our young people think about these topics? You know, how might they respond to these questions? Because I'm sure many of us could put this slide together and think, well, this is the kind of world that our young people are growing up in. In terms of science and religion and the impression that they're given, this is what a lot of them are encountering. But it's not really the whole picture, because this is also the world that our young people are growing up in. There is now more discussion going on about this interaction between science and religion than there ever has been. There are more books published, there are more websites dedicated to this topic, there are more courses going on than there ever have been before. So the discussion about a positive interaction between science and religion is really quite alive and kicking. And yet, when we ask young people what they think about this, there's still really quite a strong idea that the two are in conflict. And there's some data that supports this idea. Some of our colleagues, people we work with, notably Dr. Berry Billingsley, who is now based at Canterbury Christchurch University, has been doing a lot of research with a project called the Learning About Science and Religion project, looking at what young people think about science and religion, what opinions they have and how they form them. Just a few of the titles of her papers here. And essentially, a lot of the conclusions that they come to from their data give us this kind of picture. This is data taken from students between the ages of 15 and 18, and in response to the statement, the scientific view is that God does not exist. You can see a lot of them agreeing. A fair few of them don't really know. And the proportion who are actively disagreeing with that is not really very large, considering the amount of discussion going on about this positive interaction between science and religion. When we ask them sort of personally and get some comments back from students, again, bearing in mind the view that some people would hold that actually this is a very complicated subject, so maybe young people can't cope with thinking about it yet. These kind of comments. Science and religion are at war, they disagree, and it's making me feel uncomfortable with my religion. Or I want to believe in God, but science is making new answers. A lot of people coming to this conclusion. I don't know what to believe. So they're very much growing up with this idea that science and religion are somehow at odds with each other, that the two don't really fit together. But they do have questions. The questions are all there. These are all questions that I've been asked by young people in schools. All the same questions as you might hear from adults. All the same questions that we hear at Faraday meetings and seminars and sessions all the time. And some of these from children as young as 3. Quite genuinely. So the questions are there. And these are kids sitting in schools with all of these questions and yet forming the opinion that science and religion are at odds, that science is forming new answers and so maybe religion doesn't have a place anymore. So it kind of begs the question, why? And at this point, I risk slightly offending people, so I'm going to smile and please, please try to be nice to me in response. One of the reasons that young people still think science and faith are in conflict is this. This is a picture taken from one of our Faraday courses, not all that long ago, showing a sort of typical audience. We're all adults here. That's not a problem. Obviously, most of us invited as adults, but what this shows is actually most of the conversation going on about science and faith and the interaction between the two is going on amongst adults. We have books, some very academic, some more popularized, written by adults, mostly for adults, There's a little bit more these days for the kind of undergraduate student level, some of which is accessible to the kind of higher end of sixth form, but really very, very little around for a younger age group. So for the last 20 or 30 years, there's been all of this wonderful work going on in science and religion, and lots of us as adults are much more well-informed than we were, but our young people are still very much in a different situation with that. Another very strong contributory factor is the way that we teach. So this is a kind of classic school timetable. No surprise to see that science lessons and religious education lessons are very separate. There's nothing wrong with that in principle, except that the way that we teach science and religious education, and also history and geography and everything else, is very distinct. We teach science in one classroom as this is the way we learn about the world, these are the facts, here's the stuff, go and sit and examine it. And then in the RE classroom, the students hear lots of people have different ideas about different religions, here are a few of them, go and sit and examine it. And it's a slightly cynical view, but that's kind of the end of it. What there really isn't the opportunity for much of the time is much discussion of the philosophy of science, what it is, how it works, what its limits might be, and how it relates to other ways of thinking about the world. There's not really very much opportunity for that within the school timetable, but we also find that young people really aren't being given the opportunity for that in any other situation in their life either. So I have 3 quotes here that, for me, sort of sum up the 3 main aspects of why young people generally are not given or don't have the opportunity to explore positive science-faith interactions. The first of these comes from a teacher who says, well, not for all students, but on average, I think their view is that RE is not worth it. It won't give you answers, whereas science is the way forward. So this kind of underlines the fact that that very kind of scientistic way of thinking, that science is the ultimate form of knowledge, that if you really want to know something, you figure it out with science, and everything else is far, far below that. That's carried across in schooling, but it's also the impact of the way the media talks about science, and it's certainly what a lot of young people are growing up with, this view that science is the ultimate form of knowledge. Another comment from a teacher saying, well, if I'm honest, I'm not sure I could tell the difference at the moment between, say, intelligent design and creationism. I can't answer many scientific questions because I haven't got the expertise, but if I could, I would do. And this reflects the idea that teachers, and this also goes for church children's workers or youth workers, those generally working with young people, they often feel quite uninformed about these things, despite the fact that there's a lot of good conversation going on and there's some really good work happening to try and resource teachers and church communicators about this. But often they feel quite under-resourced. And the result of that is this third comment from a student saying, well, we don't ask science teachers questions about this anymore because we don't think that they'd answer them. We would have thought, oh, they won't answer it because it's not on their topic. And we find this kind of response not just relating to science teachers, but students and children and young people learn very quickly and pick up very quickly that, oh, we don't ask our science teachers questions about God because they don't want to answer them. And we don't ask our RE teachers questions about science because they don't want to answer them. And they'll also learn the same about the people they deal with in churches or at home. I don't ask mum and dad about that because I asked once and they didn't seem to want to answer. Or I once asked my children's worker or my Sunday school teacher something about dinosaurs and they didn't really know what to say and they looked like they didn't want to talk about it. So even very young children pick up very, very quickly. If the adults around them don't give the impression it's okay to talk about these things, then they learn not to ask. And yet they have all these questions. So the final thing to say, I'm sorry this is a bit of a downer to start off with. It does get better, I promise. But this is not an unrealistic look at where things are at the moment for young people. And when we ask the question, what does it matter? Do we need to bother talking to young people about science and faith? I think the answer to this is an overwhelming yes, because the views that young people have at the moment are the views that they will carry with them. We form our ideas very early in life, a lot of them, and carry them through with us. So the culture that is around at the moment, we're all aware there's a strong sense that science and faith are in conflict. And if we're imparting that to our children and young people, and they grow up and form a society, that holds that view even more strongly, then we have to consider, well, what happens to the young people who grow up in a church, being given input through the church, and then encounter science, and feel forced to make this kind of decision between the two, and decide, well, I'd better avoid that science if I'm going to hold on to my faith. We then end up with a generation of scientists who don't want anything to do with faith, and a generation of Christians who don't want anything to do with science. And so important scientific discussions to do with genetics, ethics, all kinds of things that are going on, healthcare and artificial intelligence, don't have the input of the voice of Christians who've thought about those things. And the church loses the input of people who thought about the science. So this, I'm aware, feels like a bit of a downer. Essentially, the point of this is to say there is a problem at the moment, and we really need to do something about it. We really need to find ways to communicate well a positive interaction between science and faith to our children and young people. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Dave to take things up a notch.
Okay, as Ruth says, I'm a Baptist minister. I've been a Baptist minister for 15 years, and before that, for 15 years, I worked for the Met Office as a weatherman. So in the next 20 minutes, you can believe everything I say, at least for the next 24 hours. I am the senior minister of a church near Watford in Croxley Green, and one of the things we've been doing there for the last 3 years is trying to engage children, primarily under 11s, and their parents, with science in the context of a church. And we're doing that through Messy Church. And that's something now we're trying to expand out to the Messy Church network. How many people know about Messy Church here? You run that? Oh, great. Wow. Do you run that in your own churches? Okay. Well, Messy Church, you'll know this anyway. Messy Church has been a rapidly growing movement, starting from a single site in 2004 in Portsmouth to now 3,500 people. Were you there? Okay. So there's about, well, okay, we'll talk about that later. There's about 3,500 Messy churches now in the UK and around the world. And it's been compared to the growth of the Sunday school movement and at the beginning of the 19th century. A big difference being, though, the Sunday school movement, although initially tried to engage with families, it rapidly moved to working with children. Messy Church is not just involved with children. It's about families together, engaging them in church together. So primarily it's working with families of preschool and primary age children, and we're looking at working with children, young people, and their parents and adults together. That's an important part of Messy Church. There was a book published a few years ago called Messy Church Theology. And interestingly, there's a chapter in that called The DNA of Messy Church. I think that's a really interesting title. It says something about how much science has penetrated our language and our understanding and how we use science to explain things and describe things. People may not know what DNA is scientifically, but at least they know that DNA defines something, defines the essential nature of something. So we use the DNA of whatever to define its essential characteristics. And in this chapter by George Lings, he says that the DNA of Messy Church is hospitality, welcoming people of faith and of no faith. It's about creativity, people using gifts, mainly around crafts and music and worship, but it's also about celebration, about encountering God and discovering something of God together. And what we've been exploring the last few years is, as well as the cutting and the sticking and the painting and the craft and the music, how might science be part of that DNA? How might simple science experiments express that DNA in Messy Church? There was some research done on the spirituality of children in the 1990s, actually asking children in primary schools about the ages of 7 and 10 to talk about their spirituality. These are schools which were not church schools, and most of the children involved didn't have a faith community background. So they were very unfamiliar with the traditional faith stories that we tell our children in church. And what this research partially found is some of those children use the language of science and technology to explore their spirituality. And they did that through an encounter with the wonder of nature just around them. They did that through the language of the simple science they were learning at primary school level and using that to talk about spiritual things. But they did it also in a way that wasn't adult. You know, when we think of science, it's about explaining how things work, about truth, about accuracy. They use science in a very imaginative way to talk about spirituality. So they link some of it in to the culture of science fiction and fantasy. And if you watch children's television, that is a constant stream now. I mean, I was born in the wrong generation, you know. In the 70s, trying to find some science fiction on television was like getting blood out of a stone. But now it's all over the place, isn't it? And also they used it very imaginatively, not just about the facts, but they used it in an imaginative, creative way to explain some spirituality in them. So they suggested that actually the language of science might provide a vehicle for us to engage children with faith and spiritual nurture and discipleship. And that's not something we've always done as church. We're very good at telling them the stories of faith, and we've developed things like Godly Play, which explore the stories of the Bible in a creative way. But maybe there's something beyond that we could do, with, especially in communities where we're dealing with families who aren't that engaged with church. And that's certainly true of Messy Church. A large proportion of the families who come do not have a traditional contact with church. So that's something we've been trying to explore in my church and a few other churches as well. So, this is where I have to make a transformation. So I have to put this clicker down. Now, as a Baptist minister, we're not very formal in the Baptists. Have you noticed that amongst Baptists? So I don't normally wear one of these. I don't normally wear a dog collar. It's only a piece of plastic anyway. Sorry if I'm letting the tricks of the trade out. And so once a month in our Messy Church, I have to change costume anyway. Excuse me, I'm going to put this down a minute. I borrowed it off my wife. She's a science technician. Once a month in our Messy Church, I turn up like this in a white coat and I transform myself into Dr. Dave. And I've become known as Dr. Dave amongst Messy Church families and also now in the community in the schools as well and a little bit further afield. So I run Dr. Dave's Messy Science Lab. This is me in my Messy Science Lab. We set it up in one of the halls of the church. We do very simple science experiments. Some of them are on the tables around the corner for you to play with. The most useful piece of scientific kit in Messy Science is these little 500 milliliter water bottles. It's amazing what you can do with them. And I have normally between 15 and 20 children and their parents, and sometimes their older siblings, coming in and working for 20, 25 minutes, just doing a very, very simple science experiment. This is tornado makers. And you see this little boy here? I went to the chip shop last night because I didn't have time to go home for dinner. And lo and behold, he was in the chip shop. He's about 7, and he had his 5-year-old sister there. And they looked at me in the queue of the chip shop and they said, "You're the science man." And their mum was there. Mum doesn't normally come to Messy Church. It's the childminder who comes. So I had a chat with them. And I said, "What's your favourite experiment?" And the little, the 5-year-old, his sister, said, I made one of those egg timer things, like on the table there. We'd done that before Christmas. This lad here, when I said, "What's your favourite science experiment?" he said, "I like the tornado maker." We did that a year ago. And yet he still remembered that. So it's impacted upon him. Now, why are we doing this? I think it relates to that DNA of Messy Church, where it's about hospitality. We're trying to say to these families, actually, science is welcome in the church. It's okay to enjoy science in a church environment. And that people who are interested in science are welcome in church. I think that's a really important message. I got interested in science about that age, 7. And by 13, I bailed from church as a very immature atheist, because there was nothing in church about science. And even my Bible class teacher was a biology teacher, and one of the deacons who was a physicist never engaged me with it, even though they knew I was interested in it. So I think we're trying to say to children and families, actually, it's okay to be interested in science in church. And also, by being a Christian and a scientist and a minister and a scientist in that environment, it does have an apologetic impact. It's not very rational. We often think apologetics is about rational arguments, but there is a powerful apologetic by saying, I'm a Christian and a scientist and interested in science. And actually, the response you get from the parents is, I never thought I'd hear a Christian and a minister talking to people about science and helping people to enjoy science. That's an apologetic. That's changing a mindset that we find in culture. It's also about creativity. Science is an aspect of human creativity. We're encouraging people to discover their gifts and to have fun with that. It shares, some theologians say, in the playfulness of God, creativity in our science. So we're exploring that. And as I said, we're discovering gifts and helping children to grow in confidence. We had one child, a 6-year-old, who came to Message Church originally, would not interact with any other children, really, but was really keen on windmills and science. And actually, through engaging with the science lab, he has started to interact with other people and other children. And in fact, now he comes in a white coat. And I have this mini-me following me around in science lab. So it's helping children to grow and develop in their interests and skills. And then finally, celebration. We're not just, we are trying to help them to have an interest in science. That's a good part of human life. But we are trying to use science to explore faith as well, to link science and faith together. So sometimes we'll use the experiments to link to a Bible story. Other times we'll use the experiments to as a vehicle for prayer and reflection on an aspect of God or an aspect of life. So as well as the science, we're doing some very simple scientific explanations. We're also using that in a worship sense or in a teaching sense, linking with the theme of the session. So some of the typical experiments, there are some on the table. So there's a cloud in a jar. All of our equipment I just fish out of home. A few things you have to buy on the web, but that's just my wife's best vase. And a salt shaker filled with hot water with red food colouring in. So it's a convection current rising up through the jar. This is dissolving M&Ms in water. Have you seen that one before? It's fascinating. Just put some M&Ms on a plate, pour a little bit of water in, and wait. And what happens is the colour comes out of the M&Ms, but it actually comes out in individual streams. And so we were doing something about love, I think, in that session. So we made heart shapes in the plates. And then we talked about what stops us from loving people, what stops us from interacting with people. We also tried to explain what was going on in the science of that. And really what's happening there is the water is polarised. It has a charge and it pulls the dye off the M&M. So what I did is I got a balloon and I made it statically charged, and I asked somebody with dyed hair if the static would pull their dyed hair off their hair. Happened to be a lady, but that's another story. So we're trying to use very simple science explanations. And then this is a rainbow maker. And there are some little pieces of plastic there which are called diffraction gratings, which will make a little rainbow if you hold them up to the light. And there we will talk about rainbows and how rainbows form, but we'll also talk about what it said in the Bible about a rainbow. That it's a sign of God's care for the earth. This is a sign of hope. So we can send them away with a little hope reminder with them. So that's kind of very simple science and how we're trying to engage people with faith. Lizzie, it's back to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Dave. So some amazing examples there of how we can practically begin discussing science and faith with very young children and their families in a church context. Some of our work we also do with churches. A lot of it is in schools as well. And we wanted to give you a bit of an overview of some of what we do in schools, partly just so you know what's going on. And if you know any schools or teachers or anybody who goes to a school, you can recommend us. But also because actually linking into schools is probably something that lots of you do, or lots of members of your congregations do. You'll have teachers in your congregations. And being able to put across these kind of ideas in school as well is really valuable. So again, summing up this a little bit, there are some real advantages to working in schools. Part of that is that a lot of children spend a lot of time in school. As this says up here, students will spend over 7,000 hours in school throughout their school career. And if some of that can be encouraging them that science and faith are, that they work together, that they're not in conflict, then I think that's very valuable. There's also a real advantage to the way that students attend things in school. They go to school, and as much as they might complain about it sometimes, they're sitting there expecting to form ideas, expecting to present some of their ideas and maybe change them a bit and think about things and take in new thoughts. And that's something that we tend to lose a little bit once we've left school. So if we can get access to children and young people whilst they're in school, it's a really, really good and really valuable time to help them think about some of these topics and questions that they might leave behind once they graduate from that. So a little brief summary of what we've been doing for the last 3 years or so that I've been around at Faraday. We've run about 250 sessions in those 3 years, meeting about 8,000 students, as I say, between the ages of 3 and 18. So very, very wide age range, all different kinds of schools, all different backgrounds, schools that would call themselves faith schools and not, and basically anywhere that anybody will have us, we'll go to. But we teach on completely widely ranging topics. We'll go into science lessons, RE lessons, we'll do assemblies, we run special sort of extracurricular sessions or cross-curricular sessions. Schools will put on a whole day or half-day workshop. Depends entirely on what the school wants, so it's really very varied. And we get overwhelmingly positive feedback. So the feedback from students and teachers and event organisers has been really, really good all the way through. It's wonderful when the kids have fun. The teachers and we love that. But also some of these comments you can see down here towards the bottom. I think if we go into a school and run an event on science and faith, and at the end of it, one of the students says, well, I now understand how science and religion are compatible, then that's quite positive feedback for us. I feel like there's something going well there. So there's a few main ways that we do this. We run some sort of particular, what we call special events. Some of these we run in conjunction with, say, the Cambridge Science Festival. Or we'll have guest lectures, so when we have lecturers come in to give Faraday termly lectures or seminars and things that we run here, we'll sometimes ask them to do a schools lecture as well. This is the kind of event, a lot of these we could run in conjunction with cathedrals. There have been some cathedrals running science festivals or running particular events where they'll invite schools in and they invite us in to do part of that. So very accessible to church situations as well. And again, all kinds of different topics. All of it just trying to stimulate some conversation and discussion that will allow children and young people to ask those questions that they have. And again, the feedback from these is really positive. So the feedback from staff as well as students, it's very, very encouraging. And a lot of the staff often comment on how much the students carry on talking about these topics afterwards. We had a session we ran here just a few weeks ago before the Christmas holiday, and one of the staff said, oh, my students could have stayed there for another hour and a half. Can we just carry on for the rest of the day? They'll just keep talking about this. They were discussing what it means to be human. What it means to be human in terms of thinking about genetics and genetic changes and the kind of genetic technologies that are around now, but also artificial intelligence, what it might mean for a robot to become human and all these kind of things that, as well as being interesting questions, are really the kind of questions that these young people are going to have to deal with very practically as they grow up. So fascinating and really important to be able to do that with some aspect of what it means in a religious sense as well. The other side of what we do is, as I say, going into schools. Quite often this is me or other members of the Faraday team or other people that we know and have worked with. And again, we cover all kinds of different topics. As you can see from the kind of general how do science and religion fit together to some more specific questions about ethics or biblical interpretation or different topics that may come up. And again, the feedback from staff and from students is always really positive. This one at the bottom here has always been a bit of a favourite of mine. This was one of the sessions I ran in a primary school, and I ran one 40-minute session with them, took in some of the fossils that a few of them are on the table there. And we talked a bit about the origins of life on Earth and exploring the development of life on Earth. They had some hands-on time with the fossils, trying to figure out what they were and how they're formed, and we explored a little bit about what we can learn about origins and thought about it in terms of how it relates to what they knew about the biblical story as well. And each week in that school they have an assembly, and each week one class gives a report of what they've been doing that week, and this week it was the turn of this class. And the teacher sent me an email following the session saying that one of the 8-year-old girls in her class stood up in front of all of the school and the teachers and the parents and had some photos that they'd taken in the session, put them on a PowerPoint, and explained to the school and the staff and the parents how before the session she'd thought science and religion didn't work together, but then they looked at some fossils and talked about this a bit, and now she knows that they do, and explained all of it to all of these people, the whole school, the staff. This is an 8-year-old girl after a 40-minute session. Not only has her view changed, but she's able to explain it and wants to explain it to everybody else as well. So these are just a few examples, again, of the kind of topics that we cover, the kind of things that we do. Again, they vary hugely depending on the school. Sometimes it's very specifically about the Christian faith. Sometimes it's much more broad about the history of science and how that's related to religious faith throughout history, as you've heard a little this morning. And again, all of these, some I've used in churches directly, all of them be very accessible in church environments for different age groups, all that kind of thing. One of the things that I do in these sessions is just to give you a kind of brief outline. We always have some focus on science, obviously. And this is really, as part of, similar to what Dave was saying, showing some way of celebrating science, of being really enthusiastic about it, showing that actually science not only is really fun, but it's something to be explored and enjoyed, and that there's real value in pursuing it. And I think that's really important, because sometimes if you go in, particularly if you go and say, well, I'm a Christian, I'm going to tell you how important religion is, that's kind of what they take from it. If you go in and say, I'm a Christian, and here's how excited I am about science, and then you begin a conversation, and they get really on board with that. And it also means that the schools love you because you're teaching science off the curriculum and ticking lots of boxes. And there's a lot of value to this, and I want to explore this a little bit with you by doing a little bit of science, if we can do. And in order to do this, I need a little bit of cash. So this is the point at which I start to feel a bit like a con artist or a magician. Does anybody have any cash they could lend me? There's people shuffling. Have I got a volunteer here? Oh, you've got loads on you. Brilliant. Perfect. I only need the one. Can I take a 20? Thank you very much. What was your name? Sorry, what was your name? Piers. Piers, do you trust me?
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Okay. So, play like a school class now. Who can tell me anything about this?
Money.
It's money, yes. Anything else about it?
It's only paper, really.
It's only paper, really. So it's made of paper. And what do we know about paper?
Burns.
It burns. Fantastic. Piers, do you trust me? Okay, so paper burns, and we're doing science. And what we do in science is we explore how the world works. Okay, we explore what it's made of and what happens when different bits of it interact. And so often in this situation, I'll have gone through, say, the scientific method, and we'll be exploring that. So I'm running through this in that same way. So I could say, okay, well, what's our question? Our question could be, what happens if we set fire to the paper? Then we bring in some background research, and we say, well, we know that paper's made of wood, and wood tends to burn if you set fire to it in the sort of right conditions. And so the hypothesis we'd make is that if we set fire to the paper, it's going to burn up. And so we could do that. We could do the experiment, and then we'd analyze it, and we'd see that probably the paper would burn, and we'd be kind of corroborating it. So that would be good science. But it wouldn't be very interesting science. And sometimes what we like to do with science is make it a little bit more interesting. So we take some things that we think we know about the world and we push it a little bit further. So for example, we could say, well, what's something that doesn't burn? This is a bit of a clue if any of you are stuck. Water, fantastic. So any ideas what might happen if we take something that we know burns, something that we know doesn't burn, mix them together and set fire to it? Piers, do you trust me? You can imagine this is really fun where you've got sort of the teacher's money. Or in one case I did this and the bishop came and sat at the back of the classroom and we ended up burning the bishop's money. It was brilliant. So something we know burns, something we know doesn't burn. What's going to happen? Any ideas? It's going to dry out, it'll smoke. Who thinks it's going to burn? Very, very enthusiastic hand at the back. Who thinks it's not going to burn? Okay, watch carefully. Ooh. I love it. Same reaction with every age group. It's brilliant. What happened? It wasn't water. Excellent. Okay, I may have lied a little bit. I apologize. I seek all kinds of forgiveness. But it was fun. So at this point, you can inspect this. I'm going to hand this back to you. It will be fine, I promise. Can you tell us anything about that now? Firstly, is it burnt?
No, it's not.
It's not burnt?
Does it smell? Does it smell burnt? Yeah, it certainly wasn't water. It's very high.
Does that smell remind you of anything?
It's the doctor.
Okay, so we've got a few guesses around here. This is often really fun and quite telling about the background of the people that you're working with. I'll often get people going, oh, it smells like nail varnish remover, or it smells like that hand rub stuff, or a pen, or it smells like my dad when he comes in from the pub on a Friday night. That kind of thing. So I did cheat a little bit. This is obviously not just water. So people at this point, I'm not going to go through the whole thing now, but people will guess and eventually get to alcohol. And is it alcohol? But what happens if you set fire to something covered in alcohol? And the whole thing would go. So it's a mixture. It's a 50-50 mixture of water and alcohol, which means that the alcohol burns off, but the water keeps the paper damp enough that it doesn't burn up. I'm sure lots of you had cottoned onto that and are playing along nicely for me, so thank you for not spoiling the magic. But as well as being quite fun, that's actually a really good way of just introducing the idea, not only that science is fun, but also of what it does, of the kind of questions that it asks, the kind of questions that it looks at. And you begin to introduce this idea that actually science looks at a very particular type of question, that it's exploring kind of certain things that we know about the world. What happens if we poke this, or sit on that, or set fire to this? And some of those little experiments can be really useful at exploring, well, what is science? How does it work? And from that point, you can get on a little bit further to thinking about, well, if this is science and this is how it works, what happens beyond that? Are there any other kinds of questions that it's worth exploring in life? You begin to be able to explore the limits of science, but you're doing it in a way that supports and corroborates science as a good and a wonderful and a clever thing. So this famous example up here that I'm sure you've seen, if not today, at some point before, of the boiling kettle, of, why is the kettle boiling? Well, it's boiling because there's energy transfer and the water's reaching 100 degrees and that kind of thing, but it's also boiling because I want a cup of tea. So you get to explore this idea that there's two very different explanations that not only are both true, but when you fit the two together, you get a bigger and better picture of what's going on. And that kind of relationship's a really good way of beginning to explore the idea that actually there are lots of very valid ways of looking at the world. Science is one of them, but it looks at a very specific part of it, and it gets its power by doing that. So then to explore things like, well, there are moral and ethical types of questions, questions of history and experience, and questions of religion, and all of these are very valid and worth exploring. And then from there, you can often take this further, and we get further on into different questions that the students might ask about things like, well, how does suffering fit into it? The suffering question always comes up, regardless of your starting point. You can start talking about quantum physics, and suddenly you end up with someone going, yeah, but if God's good and he made all that and everything, then why did my nan die? It comes up, and this can be a route into talking about those things, that they might not ask those questions otherwise. Similarly, talking about biblical interpretation. For a lot of children and young people, I say even, perhaps especially those that are brought up in the church, their view of creation and God as creator is 6 days of creation in Genesis. We drew some pictures when we were 5, we coloured them in, and that was the last they heard of it. And they're not given a chance to explore, well, what else does the Bible say about creation? Where else does it talk about God as creator? What is it meaning when it's trying to do that? How do we explore what it means? So actually, to have the chance to be able to explore, well, what is the Bible and how does it work and what's it doing and how do we think about the different parts of it? It's really, really valuable. And that's something that can definitely be done in churches, even without touching on anything that might be remotely controversial in terms of the science-faith discussion. With very young children, you can explore, what is the Bible? What's it trying to get across to us? Wonderful things about the stories being told and the cultures of the time and the different stories that were around. There's so much scope there, and it's really valuable exploring that with young people. So on top of those schools visits and the kind of things we draw out from those, we do a lot more. We run training workshops and are involved in running training workshops both for teachers and for sort of early career scientists to help them explore how they might communicate this kind of thing to young people. We always have further research going on, collaborating with others doing research in this area, trying to work out what are the best and the most key ways of exploring science and faith with young people. We're involved in producing some teaching resources, both on our own and with some other groups that are doing similar things as well. God and the Big Bang are a project that work with 14 to 18-year-olds in school, again, exploring science-faith relationships, and they're bringing out some resources to help teachers to do that themselves. And as Ruth mentioned briefly, we're just about to kick off a new project, the Faraday Institute Children's Media Project, which will involve bringing out resources specifically for children between 2 and 12 years old. Some of those will be for school teachers, some will be for use directly in churches through sort of holiday club or children's church work, and some will be for parents and for children to use at home. So I can tell you more about those later if you want to. But really, the question that comes after this is, what does it work? What's the impact of it? And I've got a few bits of data just to try and get across some of the fact that actually we think it does work. We think it's working well. So with one of the projects that we're involved with, we take some data before and after the sessions with the students, and these show you some of their opinions in response to these statements. So this statement, I believe science and religion can fit together. You can see that the numbers before, you had about 31% agreeing with that, and afterwards, 55% of them are agreeing, and 31% sort of unsure about this, but it's definitely moving in a positive direction. And from this one, you can see that actually even beforehand, we've got 50% of them interested in whether science and religion can fit together. And another 31% kind of in that unsure category, which really in a school means, well, I wasn't expecting this today, but sure, why not? Let's have a look. Thankfully, that also goes up afterwards. If it was going down, there would be a problem. But they really are very interested in these topics, in these questions, and the question and answer times that we have with them are always incredible. So this statement that I gave you earlier, the scientific view is that God does not exist. You can see the numbers changing quite drastically on that. And similarly, science shows that the universe was not created by God. So this view changing from going from an idea that actually science tells us there's no place for God to, oh, maybe science doesn't say that after all. Maybe there's a bit more freedom there. Again, another idea, often people have the idea that evolution and God or evolution and faith it's one or the other. So changes in this idea, well, evolution is compatible with creation by God. For 54% of them to be agreeing with that afterwards is quite a change. And finally this, science makes it hard to believe in God. And bear in mind that these statistics are coming from lots of students who won't have any faith of their own necessarily, wouldn't consider themselves to be religious, but beforehand are saying, well, yeah, but I don't think you could be religious. It would be very difficult to believe in God because of what science is saying. And that changes a lot as well. And as you can see from some of this feedback, again, the impact, whether you're looking at the stats or the direct feedback we get from students and teachers, as I've shown you sort of throughout, the impact of this is really positive. I gave you quite a bleak picture when we started off of the views of young people on this, but these really are making changes. The views after these sessions are much, much more positive. Lots of young people getting the impression that actually these two things can work together. And as I said to a couple of you as we've been chatting, it's often not really about trying to get across any complicated scientific or theological discussion to them. We always say if the only thing that they take away from it is that once I met somebody who was interested in science and in faith and had a faith, then that really will make a huge difference. And I believe it does. So Dave's going to finish up here.
So Lizzie says, does it work? We don't know if messy science works because we're in a different cycle of the project. We do know from some survey work I did as part of a master's essay I'm writing that 25 messy churches are using science in some way at the moment. And in terms of who's leading that, there's quite a wide range of scientific expertise amongst the people who lead science in messy church. Some people have no scientific education background at all. Some people have doctoral experience and research experience. So we're trying to pitch this as a way that is enables anybody with an interest in science to have a go at this in the local churches. In terms of who we're engaging, a lot of us started off doing this in our messy churches to engage, shall we say, the bored older boys, the 8 to 11-year-olds who got fed up of, cutting something out and sticking it to a piece of card or something like that. So that's how we started. I just happened to say, I'll do some science, because I've been doing science on fun days in schools for quite a while. But we've been doing it for 3 months when a 6-year-old looked up at me one day when I was doing a Christmas event with the schools and said, "You're Dr. Dave. I can't wait till I'm old enough to do science, Messy Science Lab with you." So we then opened it up to any age group. And so now each month I've got children as young as 5 being involved up to about the age of 11, and sometimes their older siblings come along with parents to help out. Generally, that's the case in these 25 churches who are in Messy Science as well. It engages under 5s right up to over 11s and even adults as well. And we also asked them, was it boys or girls who were doing this? And actually, in every age category, it's boys and girls, which is a good thing, because girls are often put off science at some point. But actually, I think I have more girls doing science now than I do boys, which I think is fantastic. So I'll skip the next few slides. This project has been funded by what David was talking about this morning, the project up in Durham, Scientists in Congregations. It's one of the projects they funded. And there are 10 of us working to write 10 chapters of 10 experiments each on different scientific subjects. And the aim is to have a book published in the summer of this year with descriptions of the experiment, simple explanations of the science. We think that's important. But also some suggestions of how you're going to link that into Bible stories, prayer activity, or help people to discover something in the nature of God. So that should be coming out later in the summer. We've already started passing out some of the experiments to different messy churches to trial them. We've got 30 messy churches who are going to do 5 experiments each, just to see if they work. I mean, all the authors have tested them already. They do work, we hope, but it's a good idea to test them out. What's interesting, talking to Lucy Moore, who runs Heads Up Messy Church and is working on this as well, is the responses that she's getting back from those churches is people who are running Messy Church are getting back in touch with us, saying, I used to be a university lecturer, I used to be head of science or a science teacher, I used to have a career in science, and now I'm involved in Messy Church. And it seems to be bringing out in our churches a pool of expertise which is often hidden and we don't draw on. That's something we found out amongst some components of the Baptist family a few years ago. I teach science and faith on a lay training program in the southern part of the United Kingdom for the Baptists. And in one of the years, out of the nearly 40 participants we had on the lay training program, half of them had science degrees. That's much higher than the general level in the population. And actually, interestingly, when I did the similar survey in Hertfordshire amongst the Baptist ministers, a third of them had at least a science degree. And we want to encourage that expertise in our churches to engage children, adults, families with science. That's part of what we're trying to do. The other thing that I do as Dr. Dave is I go into schools, a bit like Lizzie does. I just go into my local schools. I have a colleague, John, who's the youth and children's minister. He goes and does the RE lessons. I tend to go and do science lessons in primary school now, because actually primary school teachers are not that confident about science. So here, most of these talks are just on science. Because of my background in weather, I do quite a lot on extreme weather and climate change. I've done chaos theory for actually that was a session for a University of Third Age science group in Watford, so I did that. I did one on space. Do you remember the partial eclipse last year? I got to go in and talk about the eclipse to the school, and I ended up doing 2 classroom sessions for 2 classes on space. Mainly because half of them were going into one of these star domes, which they bought in, and they wondered what they were going to do with the other half of the year. So I said, I'll do something for you. So, and you can have a bit of fun with that. You can be a bit creative with that. One of the things I did with them was played a game called Galaxy Zoo. Now, not all galaxies have names, but in the past, sometimes we gave galaxies names, not numbers. So I gave the kids some galaxies, and I said, can you come up with a name for the galaxy? And so here we go. Here's the first galaxy. What do you think the name of that galaxy is? What would you call that galaxy? Sorry? A fried egg? Yeah, okay, I can see that. Any other ideas? A jellyfish. Well, you're very imaginative, and some of the children are. Actually, that's called the cartwheel galaxy. Oh, you see. And what about this one? What do you think that is? Catherine wheel, yeah, that's called the pinwheel galaxy, probably because it's an American naming it. What about that one? Black hole, not quite. Pardon? Plug hole. Yeah, actually, it's interesting this. I gave that to a group of children, and you know what? One of them came up with the right name just by looking at it. That's called the Black Eye Galaxy. That one? What about that one? That's the Tadpole Galaxy. And what about that one? Fried egg? Do you think fried egg? That's called Hose Galaxy. That's probably named after the person who first saw it. But actually, one of my kids said it looked like the fried egg galaxy. But I think it's a much better name. So I know this is imaginative, this is creative, but it's engaging them with some aspects of science. And as part of that thing I was doing in the local church, I took this telescope in to try and project the eclipse. We had the whole school on the playground with their eclipse viewers. And I was going to project it onto this big piece of card to show them. This is one I tried a few days earlier from the church garden. Do you know one of the reasons I gave up observational astronomy at university? Cloudy. Yeah, it was cloudy, and we didn't see a thing. It got very cold, but we never saw a thing. But I know it was. If I'd have gone to Dunstable, half an hour north from me, I would have seen it. But never mind. I show you this because I don't think you need to be an academic scientist. I don't think you need to know a lot about science to engage your community with science. If you've got a general background interest in science or a degree in science or an A-level in science, you probably know more than the average primary school teacher. And actually, they will probably bite your hand off if you can offer them anything. And there is always a moment, even if you're talking about science, to talk about faith and how science inspires you. So it's just another way as churches we can engage with our communities and engage children in the issues of science and faith. I think, Lizzie, it's back to you.
Thank you. Just for the last minute, just to sum up a little bit of actually what can you do as church leaders, as ministers, and what opportunities are there directly for you to get involved and engage with this. First thing you can do, if you're so given, which I assume many in this room are, do pray for this work, for the work that's already going on. We need it. There are good things happening, but they're only going on because we think this is work that is important to God. So please do pray for us in every way that you can think to do so. Spread the word as well, like I said, about our work. We go all over the UK, about Messy Church Does Science. These are really excellent things for churches and schools to be involved with, and they are available. But we can only get into schools if we're invited, or similarly with churches. You can, if you so wish, and you have pots of money lying around and want somewhere to put it, you're very, very welcome to donate if you so desire. I only put this up there in case anybody's sat on a couple of thousand and they want something to do with it. But each of you is in touch with young people. Whether you are directly involved with the children's or youth ministry or not, there are young people who will be influenced by the way that you think about and talk about science and faith, and you can encourage them. You also, I'm sure, have many teams that you work with, and they will have an influence on the way that the young people they're in touch with will think about science and faith. So you are the people who need to encourage our next generations in how they think about this and how open they can be to it. You can take part in some training, so you'll get a tick on that one already because you're here. But similarly, encourage those in your churches who work with children and young people to do that. Give them links that Eleanor's been talking about, or give them books to read, or send them to some of the resources that are available. This is really very valuable. You can run your own sessions, as Dave's just encouraged you. Schools will bite your hand off if you offer them a good opportunity to talk about these things. You can run them in churches, set up sessions, invite speakers in, whatever you can do, but you have the capability to do that. And you can tell your own story. Each of you here, you have some background or involvement or interest in science and in faith. And like we said, the thing that makes the most difference in this isn't deep, in-depth discussion of science or theology necessarily. It's just meeting people who are enthusiastic about both science and faith, who combine them practically in their own lives and have an interest and want to share that with people. So please, this is our call. Do something about this. Do recognise the fact that you have an influence on the children and young people in your churches and your congregations, and you have an opportunity to make that a really good influence. There are plenty of places you can find out more about this. Here are a few of them. I'm not going to go on about any of these. Do ask us questions, but we're going to open up now. If any of you have any questions for either myself or for Dave, do please ask.
Thanks. Dave, could you just say how it fits into the Messy Church programme? I mean, in terms of typical sessions.
I think, messy churches vary, but they tend to begin, we begin with just a gathered kind of act of worship and some songs and telling a story, one of the Bible stories. And then typically that's the moment when people go away and do craft activities. So in our setup, we've put the science in a separate room. We've called it the science lab. So we have a 20 to 25 minute session. The children have to make a choice at that point whether they're going to do craft or they're going to do science. So that's what we do in our church. I know other messy churches actually run a science table as part of the craft activities. So people actually move around those activities. I think there are advantages in both. I think by having a standalone session, we've got 20 minutes to do an experiment rather than say 5 minutes to do something before people move on. So we have a little bit more continuity. And then we tend to gather back together to just to show what we've made or done, and that's a moment when we can talk about the science and a little bit more about faith or use it for prayer at the end as well. So that's how we do it in our sessions.
Any other questions?
Just a question about your statistics at the beginning about the group of people that you did with that. Were there Muslim students among those that you asked? Because being religious is much more important, it seems to me, to people in the Muslim community in this country than it is to kind of our vaguely Christian population.
Yes, yeah. So obviously the downside of very quickly flashing through statistics is there's a huge amount of data involved there, and these are sort of very summary statistics. In almost all the schools that we go into, there's a very, very wide range of backgrounds. So that would include people of all different kinds of Christian background, from sort of very nominal Christian faith to very strong Christian faith in all different denominations. Also, again, a spectrum still, but within the Muslim faith, from those who would say, oh yeah, my family's Muslim, but doesn't impact us that much, to those who would be brought up very strongly to believe, yes, I'm religious and that's my primary sort of descriptor. So yes, it would include a whole range, and the statistics could be much further broken down to look at those. And in some of the papers that Barry Billingsley has published, he has more of a breakdown of different students' reactions. Any other questions? Yes, back there.
So might it in fact enable a way of Muslims, Christians and people of other major faiths to talk better to each other about faith because of the way in which it opens up for everybody similar questions?
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the major advantages to what we're doing, as I say, is not only exploring what is science and what isn't science, what does it do, what kind of questions does it look at, but then exploring what is faith. What does it mean to say you're religious? And once you begin really exploring this, it takes away some of the initial fear, perhaps, of approaching the scary topic of religion. And you start to explore, well, what does it mean to different people? We have a local school that runs a session for their Year 10 students every year under the heading, What is Faith? And I went to present at that recently. And so I gave an introduction about what is faith, looking at it from a sort of philosophical perspective and looking at science and religious faith and what we can learn from science about how we think about things like proof and evidence and faith and those kind of words. So explored around it with that. And then they followed it by having myself as a Christian representative, they had a Muslim representative there, and they had a Buddhist representative. And the students moved around each of us and asked us all questions about our faith and worked out what the similarities and differences were. So it's definitely an opener for that kind of conversation as well. Yes, thank you.
It's for Dave.
Mm?
Do you have like a curriculum for the year, or each lesson is independent, or?
We are trying to produce this book of 100 science experiments, which is linked to different either Bible themes or prayer activities or Christian festivals. That's the resource that's coming out in the summer. So we hope that will resource a wider range of churches. In terms of my church, each messy church session has a theme. So I try and choose some science experiments that can link into the theme. That sometimes is pretty tricky, so sometimes they don't. But they're always fun. And there's always something, I do link it into faith or prayer at some point along the way. Sometimes we have to do demonstrations because we have to think about risk. So water into wine is a great demonstration, but it's not something I'd give for the children to do because it's not water. You have to use sodium hydroxide, which is caustic. And you have to use an indicator called phenolphthalein, which is dissolved in alcohol, which is also an irritant. So that's a demonstration, but it's a pretty spectacular one, even if it is rosé wine at the end, not red.
Do you drink it?
No.
So what's the point?
Well, that just kind of, we're using that as an illustration for the Bible story in the end. That's a bit of fun, really. Yeah. Some of them, they do link into the Bible story. So over there you've got a Cartesian diver where you squeeze it and the little floaty thing sinks. Now, when I first came up with that, we were doing the story of Naaman bathing in the river 5 times. So we turned the water brown with some brown food colouring to make it muddy. And it was just a reminder of that story, a reinforcement of the story. Actually, reflecting it, I think you could use it in a different way. Talk about, actually, when you're under pressure, what makes you sink? Some of this stuff is actually quite profound for the adults. We did one the other month called a Barton's pendulum, where you string different length pendulums on a piece of string, and you have a master pendulum which swings, and only one of the pendulums on the string starts to swing. Now, I use that with the kids. To talk about how they relate to other people, how they care for other people. On the Saturday, I used that on a church away day with my leaders as a prayer activity and asked them what they were thinking as they looked at it. They came up with some of the most profound things out of that. So it works at different levels, and I think, depending on who you're working with, you have to pitch it at different levels.
Yes.
I'm just wondering how to juggle with messy science with multi-sensory teaching techniques. Would it be related to each other, or I'm wondering? That's
interesting. I've not thought about that. I think one of the important things about the science we do, the demonstrations are fine, and they can be more spectacular. But I think what's important for me is the hands-on nature of it. The kids are playing with the various pieces of equipment, building something, following instructions. We haven't done too much on taste, although some of the experiments in the book are about taste and sight and sound. I did do something on colour blindness and optical illusions. So I think there's a crossover there, yeah. Yeah, thank you.